My name's John Monahan. I am a science teacher and I love science, and what's always interested me about science is a lot of the backstories about how people made their discoveries and why they went into science. And so I did a book on that, again called They Called Me Mad. And it talks about some of the folks that were so far out there that a lot of them were considered to be mad. But today we're going to talk about mad scientists, both fictional and real, and some that are somewhere in between. There we go. Before I start, though, I'd just like to take a minute to say, get that out of the way early. All right. So, if you're like me, you love mad scientists. They're great. They're all over the media, books, TV, comic books, all kinds of stuff. And we could probably sit here and spend several hours of people naming their favorite mad scientists. I'm just going to bring up a couple of them. Rotwang from Metropolis, a great one. A lot of the tropes that we think of when we think of as a mad scientist, the wild hair, the mechanical hand, stuff like that really originated with him. Captain Nemo, another great mad scientist who tried to use his technology to try to better the world, at least in his view. Davros, for all you Doctor Who fans out there, creator of the Daleks. Dr. Doom, also for all you comic book fans out there, one of my favorites. I don't know if we have any Fringe fans out here, but Dr. Walter Bishop is another favorite. And my all-time favorite, of course, has to be Dexter from Dexter's Laboratory. So you can see that they kind of run the gamut. We've got, those that are evil, those that are simply misunderstood, those that are comedic, those that are serious, those that are tragic. And so you have to kind of ask, if we have an image that permeates our society, our culture so much, where did it come from? Where did we come up with this? So here is the mad scientist. I mean, here is Dr. Frankenstein. This has, everything that people think of when they think of a mad scientist. They have the lab, the electrical equipment, the hunchback assistant, all that stuff. But we have to kind of think, when you looked at those mad scientists that I referred to, and when you look at Dr. Frankenstein here, they're very diverse, but they all have a couple of features in common. They're all white males. I think most folks would be fairly hard-pressed to think of a mad scientist who isn't a white male. There may be a couple of notable exceptions, but most of them are. They're all thin, usually unhealthily thin. They have crazed eyes. They are megalomaniacs, almost universly, and they are obsessed with that quest for knowledge and power. And obsession is one of the key words here. I told the folks at work that I was coming to do a talk on mad scientists, and they're like, "Oh, really? You?" To which I can only respond, "I'm not thin." So again, these are a couple of things, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time to talk about where some of these things came from. So first, where does the image come from? And again, here we have Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. 1816, she was having a bad summer vacation. She and her husband and a couple of friends were vacationing in Geneva, Switzerland, and it was rainy and miserable, and they got bored. And so to kind of amuse themselves, they decided, okay, we'll have a contest. We'll see which one of us can write the best ghost or best scary story. Okay, now here she is, she's up against her husband, Shelley, and Lord Byron. So the competition was pretty stiff, and she managed to beat them all, which is pretty interesting. And again, there's a lot of things that you can take away from her book, but here's a quote that I find that is particularly apt. Learn from me, if not by my precepts, at least by my example, how dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge, and how much happier that man is who believes his native town to be the world than he who aspires to become greater than his nature will allow. Now again, this is 1816, and this was a period when the Industrial Revolution was coming into full swing, and you had this tension between the industrialist and the science that they were promoting and the more romantic notions of the past. So this was sort of an expression of that. That, yeah, knowledge is nice, but if you get too much knowledge, that's the thing we'll come back to. If you get too much knowledge, learn too much about the world, that's where the danger comes in. What's also interesting is if you actually read Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus, and you read over the material there, yeah, it's about a mad scientist, but that idea of someone who acquired too much knowledge, knowledge that man was not meant to know sort of thing, that really predates Frankenstein by a fairly wide margin. Before they had mad scientists, they had the mad alchemist. Here we have a picture of Faust, and the idea was, again, he made his deal with the devil in order to acquire that knowledge that was dangerous, that man was not meant to know. Here, again, is a quote from Frankenstein early in the book. This is from Victor Frankenstein's point of view, saying, "When I returned home, my first care was to procure the whole works of this author, and afterwards of Paracelsus and Albertus Magnus. I read and studied the wild fantasies of these writers with delight. They appeared to me treasures known to few besides myself." Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Paracelsus and Albertus Magnus, they were alchemists. And today we have a whole vision of the alchemist, being off, mixing their chemicals, trying to turn lead into gold, or trying to develop potions of immortality. But really, at the time, there was sort of a transition going on that we'll talk about between what we think of as alchemy and what we think of as real science. Okay, and it wasn't one of those things that would just sort of, bam, we go from religion to real science. It took a while. Okay, and in fact, there's a bit of overlap. Okay, so let's take a look for a second at the alchemists. Some of them you may be familiar with. Nicholas Flamel, for all of you Harry Potter fans, was actually a real fellow, real alchemist, and he did a number of interesting experiments, made some discoveries. Here is Paracelsus, perhaps one of the most famous of the alchemists. He's mainly famous for what came to be known as his expression that what makes the poison is the dose. And in fact, I have a T-shirt that actually has his picture on it from the American Society of Toxicologists. So he managed to get a decent amount of fame. But as I said, it wasn't a sudden transition. There were a lot of folks that were on the borderline. Okay, one of whom, Robert Boyle. Many folks, if you read textbooks, you hear about him being the father of modern chemistry, and people talk about the great contributions he made to scientific method and that sort of thing. But he really was an alchemist. And some of his scientific experiments he wrote down and put out for the public, but there were a number of things, his alchemical things, that he kept secret, which was, in the method that alchemists used. They were very protective of their secrets. So we have Robert Boyle, who is, again, on that borderline between alchemy, between magic and science. Another fellow that some of you have heard of, Robert Hooke. He went on afterwards. He was actually Robert Boyle's assistant. That's how he got his start. And he went on to become a major scientist in his own right, nemesis of Isaac Newton, which I'll talk about in a moment. But it's interesting to note here, as assistant of Robert Boyle, if you read descriptions of Robert Hooke, he was a hunchback. So again, that association between the alchemist and the hunchback, between the mad scientist and the hunchback, goes back fairly far. I said that Isaac Newton was his arch nemesis. They really, really hated each other. In fact, this is a painting that was done after Robert Hooke's life, after he was dead. There was exactly one portrait of him that was painted during his lifetime. After he died, Isaac Newton burned it. So they really, really hated each other. So we'll take a minute, though, and talk about Isaac Newton. He was, again, also has this image of being, father of science. He did all kinds of great things with math and gravity and optics and all kinds of amazing discoveries, but he was, in fact, an alchemist himself. And if you look at his writings, he wrote somewhere upwards of 1 million words of text about alchemy. He wrote as much about alchemy as he did about science. Yes, sir.
A friend of mine who, I asked him about it. He's sort of expert on 17th century. And he claimed that part of what he was writing was he was just writing verbatim the words of of older authors.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way you learn things.
Yeah.
Was by writing their books.
Right.
Right, and again, so he was reading, again, that the works of the ancient alchemists, those that hadn't been encrypted or were too hard to decipher. But a lot of the things that Newton did also fit in with that image of what we think of as the mad scientist. In the course of doing his alchemical experiments, for instance, this is a picture of him when he was fairly young. This portrait was probably done when he was in his late 20s or so. Notice his hair is snow white. When asked about that, he attributed it to a lot of the experiments he did with mercury as part of his alchemical experiments. And in fact, he got so into this and that they kept him so busy up at night that he hired an assistant, a sort of distant cousin of his, a fellow named Humphrey Newton. And Humphrey wrote a description of his boss when he was at work. This is, again, about his alchemical experiments. So intent, so serious upon his studies, that he eat very sparingly, nay, oft-times he has forgotten to eat at all. He rarely went to bed till 2 or 3 o'clock, sometimes not till 5 or 6, especially at spring and fall of the leaf, at which times he used to employ about 6 weeks in his laboratory, the fires scarcely going out either night or day. He, sitting up one night, as I did, another till he had finished his chemical experiments, in the performance of which he was most accurate, strict, and exact. And if that doesn't sound like a mad scientist for you, Humphrey continued, but what his aims might be, I was not able to penetrate into. But his pains, his diligence, at those set times made me think he aimed at something beyond the reach of human art and industry. So again, even despite the great contributions he made to science, he was a little far out there. Interestingly, I did a lot of research about Newton and these other mad scientists as part of my book. And if you were to look at him, if he had been around today, I would bet money that he would have been put on the autism spectrum, reading descriptions. And in fact, a lot of the great scientists who were considered mad did have some mental disorders or mental obsessions and stuff, and today probably would have been heavily medicated. In fact, one of the themes I like to come back to is that in a way that, brain difference, I'll call it, was what allowed them to essentially look at the same thing that everybody else was looking at and see something different. So that there may be a link here between what we'd consider madness and what we consider genius. But again, we'll come back to that. Okay. Now, another fellow who really kind of was a great scientist, he was a surgeon and made great advances in medicine. But John Hunter, he got into medicine the old-fashioned way, with a lantern and a shovel. His brother, as it happened, owned a medical school. And being a medical school, they needed cadavers for the students to practice upon. And John's job was to procure them by any means necessary. So he would either hire someone, or on a couple of occasions, he went out himself and procured, shall we say, the bodies that they were to use. He would then go and he aided in the dissections. So over the course of a very couple of years, he ended up doing thousands of dissections, and he became really, really good at it. Okay, his job was to aid in the dissections and also to take the specimens that they had of the muscles and veins and that sort of thing and prepare them as medical exhibits or medical objects that they could use to study. And in fact, some of them were so precisely done that they're still on display today. You can actually go to the John Hunter Museum in London and see some of them. But again, there were a lot of things that John Hunter, besides the digging up of dead bodies, had that might remind one of a mad scientist. And in fact, he directly inspired at least 2 of them. Okay? First of all, you have to look at the house that he had. He became rather successful, and he sort of outgrew the house that he had been living in. So what he did is he bought one house, row home in London, and that wasn't quite big enough for him. So he bought that one, and he bought the one on the opposite side of the alley, and then he connected the 2 of them. So he had this large house, and here's just a brief description of it. Unseen by the guest was Hunter's dissection room. In the attic, his private printing press and quarters for his many students and assistants. The back of the house, which had formerly been front of the Castle Street house, opened onto a busy thoroughfare. Next to it was the ramp leading down to the subterranean stables where Hunter could have his less savory specimens discreetly delivered. Okay. Now, this became a fairly well-known landmark in London, and in fact, it was so well-known that about 100 years or so later, when Robert Louis Stevenson, was writing his book about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that's the house he used as the model for Dr. Jekyll's house. And in fact, if you read the book, Jekyll refers to the house as being something that he inherited from a famous surgeon. Guess who? Okay. Now, he did a lot of work, again, with human cadavers, human anatomy. He also got interested in, at some point, animal anatomy and did a number of work dissecting various specimens and studying them. And he studied both preserved specimens and live animals that he had purchased for purposes of studying or keeping. And he eventually outgrew this house, too, because of his collection of bones and skeletons and various preserved specimens and things. And so he went and bought a bigger place outside of town, outside of London. And the description that he has of the house is just something out of a movie. You know, you have to read this. Visitors to the home were greeted by all manner of howls, barks, bleats, and snarls as they approached the large iron gates. Once on the grounds, they would have seen a fish pond decorated with animal skulls, and the front doors of the house adorned with crocodile jaws. Upon the lawn grazed zebras, mountain goats, and Asiatic buffalo alongside the more typical sheep and cattle. From the kennel could be heard various dogs and jackals, including Hunter's favorite, a large wolf-dog hybrid given to him by an animal dealer named Wild Beast Brooks. Love the name. A large hillock in the garden housed lions and leopards, and around the building was a 6-foot-deep trench that ended in a sturdy set of wooden doors leading to Hunter's underground laboratory, or laboratory if you prefer. If you haven't figured out which mad scientist he inspired, though, you have to go back and look at Hunter's letters. There was one of his students, medical students, wrote to him for advice on a case, and one of the great advances he made in surgery is that he preferred not to do it if he didn't have to. That alone probably saved thousands of lives. But when he wrote back to the student, he said, and I quote, "Perhaps the best you can do is to do little." So here's the fellow that inspired both Dr. Jekyll and Dr. Dolittle. That's a fairly interesting pedigree, I think. Interesting guy. Next, again, here's a fellow. By this time, he was kind of around at the time of John Hunter. This is Joseph Priestley, and he was another interesting fellow. He was a chemist, but he didn't start out as a chemist. He started out actually as a school teacher. Interesting guy. He was apparently very good school teacher and ended up doing some science lessons for his students. And he really got intrigued with that idea of science. And the science that was most prevalent, that was most cutting edge at the time that Priestley was doing his writings back around the late 1700s was electricity. Okay, so he decided to go and write a book about electricity and those who experimented with it. They called themselves electricians back in the day. And so he went to London to do some research and happened to meet this nifty fellow named Benjamin Franklin. Franklin went and basically worked with him and talked about science experiments. You know the famous description of, the one that's actually just a story about Benjamin Franklin standing out in a lightning storm with a kite, that apocryphal tale? It's from Priestley's book. Okay, so he's the one that helped publicize that. But again, Franklin sort of had him bit with the scientific bug, and so he started buying his own apparatus and doing his own experiments. And in the course of doing those, he did a number of interesting experiments in which he discovered this nifty stuff that he called dephlogisticated air. Today we call it oxygen. Okay, he took a particular mercury compound, it's called mercury calc, or was back then. He had it in a glass jar, exposed a lens that he focused the light upon it to make it ignite, and when it did, it gave off a gas. Okay, well, Priestley assumed since it gave off a gas, it must be that newly discovered gas that we now call carbon dioxide. So he figured the way to test for carbon dioxide is, when you put a match in that stuff, it goes out. It doesn't do that when you put it in pure oxygen. This kind of intrigued him. This was cool stuff. So Priestley, he went and he tried a couple of experiments with it. He tried placing some mice. This is back in the day before we worried about animal welfare. He put some mice in jars, and he noticed that within a couple of minutes, they stopped moving. They suffocated. But when he put them in a jar with this new gas that he had discovered, they were fine for quite a while. And so again, in the mode of many a great scientist, what do you do if you have this great discovery? You test it on yourself. So Joseph went and he took a deep snootful of this stuff, and here's his description of how he felt. The feeling of it to my lungs was not sensibly different from that of common air, but I fancied that my breast felt peculiarly light and easy for some time afterwards. Who can tell but that in time this pure air may become a fashionable article and luxury? Hitherto, only 2 mice and myself had the privilege of breathing it. Okay. So again, once you start testing stuff on yourself, you kind of go into mad scientist territory. The other interesting mad scientist bona fide that Priestley had is he actually had his lab burned to the ground by a torch-wielding mob. They were more ticked off about his politics than his science, but still, I think it counts. So Priestley, he discovered oxygen, and shortly after he moved, actually, he eventually essentially got chased out of England and moved over here. But back over in England, where he had been doing his work, another interesting fellow came along named Humphrey Davy. Now, again, experimenting with gases like carbon dioxide, oxygen, and stuff was very fashionable at the time. And Davy was doing his experiments in that. He had been hired by this medical institute. They thought there might be medical applications for things like oxygen. Who knew? And so Davy did a number of experiments to see which ones he could find. And being of the mad scientist's vein, he tested them on himself. Fortunately for him, one of the first ones he discovered was something called nitrous oxide. It had actually been discovered by Priestley, but Humphrey Davy, he's the one who decided that, well, we're going to test this stuff out. So he did. He basically took a sample of this stuff and took a big snootful. And here's his description of the first human being to ever take nitrous oxide that we know of. A thrilling extended from the chest to the extremities was almost immediately produced. I felt a sense of tangible extension, highly pleasurable in every limb. My visual impressions were dazzling and apparently magnified. By degrees, as the pleasurable sensation increased, I lost all connection with external things. I existed in a world of newly connected and newly modified ideas. I theorized, I imagined that I made discoveries. This dude was tripping. And he, of course, though being a serious researcher, he discovered the effects of this wondrous new chemical and did what any serious researcher would do. He ran out and told all of his buddies about this cool way he had found to get high. He essentially became the Timothy Leary of the 19th century. They would have nitrous oxide parties. They would do demonstrations of it where they'd call some poor sap up on stage and give him a snootful of the stuff and do interesting things. They didn't actually figure out you can use it for anesthesia for about 50 years or so. Eventually they got to that, but they had quite a bit of fun in the meantime. So again, both of those guys have a certain contribution to the mad scientist myth. Okay, now, if you really, really want to talk about mad scientists, though, and you talk about the Frankenstein story, in the movies they had all this elaborate electrical equipment. It's interesting that in Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's book, the word electricity is used exactly twice. Neither one of which is being something that Victor Frankenstein was using. So the electricity stuff was sort of added to the Frankenstein legend earlier, but this fellow, Luigi Galvani, may have been one of the fellows who helped develop that link. He was an Italian anatomist, and what Galvani did is he was doing all kinds of experiments. This was back in the day before people specialized. Nowadays you have somebody who specializes in biology or physics or chemistry or some subdiscipline of those. Back in the day, they did a little bit of everything. Okay, and so Luigi, he was doing some anatomy dissections of frogs. he was also using one of these devices. That's called a Wimshurst generator, and you crank it up and it generates electrical sparks. Nifty thing. Well, his assistant was turning this device, looking at the cool sparks, at the same time that Luigi was doing a dissection of the frog. And so as he's doing the dissection with his surgical knife, a spark of electricity arced from the machine to the knife, and therefore to the frog, and the frog jumped. And Luigi was a little taken aback by that. He called his assistant over to take a look at it, and the frog just sort of sit there. So, he tested it out, took his knife and poked it again. By now, the guy wasn't turning the machine, so it didn't do anything. But by doing the experiment with it, he finally made that connection between the electricity and the movement. And he got with that idea what he called animal electricity, but the idea that there is this connection, this electrical impulse that causes muscles to move. Okay. Now, fairly, creepy story if you think about this guy electrocuting frog legs to see them jerk. He had a nephew. His nephew was a fellow named Giovanni Aldini. And Aldini took Galvani's work, which by then had been called galvanism, and he kicked it up a couple of notches. Okay, because Aldini, he was very, very interested in his uncle's work, and he wanted to extend and see how much more he could do with it. And being an industrious fellow, he not only did a number of experiments with his electricity, but he took his show on the road. Okay, this was, back in the day before people had cable TV and Facebook and all those kinds of things to waste their time on. And so one of the things they would do in order to amuse themselves is they would go to scientific lectures. They would go into the big lecture hall, they'd pay, a couple of pence to get in, and then they would have demonstrations of the latest scientific wonders. Well, what Aldini would do, among other things, is he would do things like take the head of a cow, severed head of a cow that had been freshly killed, and he would apply electricity to it to make the eyes flutter open. And the mouth would open and close as if the animal were trying to moo. He would do similar things with dogs and all manner of things. And for the big finale, he was a real showman. For the big finale, he would often do this with the body of an executed criminal. This is a description from one particular criminal that he used, excuse me, when he was doing his act in London. This is from one of the newspapers. On the first application of the process to the face, the jaws of the deceased criminal began to quiver, and the adjoining muscles were horribly contorted, and one eye was actually opened. In the subsequent part of the process, the right hand was raised and clenched, and the legs and thighs were set in motion. Now, again, we're fairly jaded nowadays. Back in the 1800s, you see this stuff, you take it seriously. They don't know from special effects, right? In fact, this newspaper article went on to say that one of the poor fellows who was in the audience was so convinced that Aldini had brought this body back to life that shortly after the performance, he literally had a heart attack and dropped dead. Yes, sir?
Some Scandinavian researchers in the 1960s actually published an article proposing use of electrical stimulation of motor nerves as a way of determining post-mortem interval. Because you have the depletion of ATP, so eventually you can't make them.
Yeah, that's one of the things is they had to use very fresh.
The photographs are particularly weird.
Yes. Yeah. Well, actually, I talked earlier about John Hunter. He did some research in which, again, this is late 1700s, and he proposed that with drowning victims, you could actually help revive them by applying an electric shock to their hearts. It's not bad for the 1700s. All right. So again, now we've got the electricity. Now we've kind of got the full package. We've got the mad scientists. We've got the wild experiments. We've got the electricity. Things are really starting to come together for this mad scientist myth we've got going. So now we hit the big time. This is the gentleman who, you cannot talk mad scientist without talking about Nikola Tesla. Nikola Tesla, he was the man when it comes to mad scientist. He was an immigrant. He's the classic one, stepped off the boat with nothing but a couple of coins in his pocket. And interesting story, he got a couple of odd jobs, and eventually the economy sort of turned south. He was out of work. And he ended up getting this contract to work for a fellow named Edison. Edison was using DC current to power a lot of machines and a lot of houses in New York at the time. And so he made Tesla an offer. He said, if you can get our transformers to work properly, our electrical switching machines, if you can get them to work in an improved manner, I will give you $30,000. Now, again, this is the 1800s. 30,000 bucks, that's a significant bit of change. So Tesla, he worked on that for months. For months and months, he worked, he slaved on that. He finally got it done. He'd perfected it. He took it to Edison and said, look, Mr. Edison, I had this. Where's my money? And Edison looked at him and said, oh, I'm sorry. You don't understand our American sense of humor, do you? Things didn't really get any better between the two of them after that. Because again, Tesla, he made discoveries in alternating current. Edison at the time was doing his work with direct current, okay? And basically he had New York City wired up to use DC power. He kind of had a monopoly on it, but DC has some disadvantages. If you're trying to transport it like over long distances, you end up having to have a powering station like every mile or so, which gets kind of expensive with Manhattan real estate prices. You also end up crisscrossing the city with these large cables. Have to be fairly big around. And with all these electricity cables, like crisscrossing the streets, it looked like a spider web. Okay. One of the problems they had is trolley cars. They had horses pulling the trolley cars back in those days. And what would happen with all these electrical wires is that sparks would arc from the wires down to the tracks, and the poor horses were getting shocked. At which point, you know, they would take off, and people were getting run over and things. It got to be such a big problem that people actually kind of got used to it. They learned to dodge out of the way of the trolleys. In fact, the people in Brooklyn became particularly good at dodging, hence the name Brooklyn Dodgers. Actually, that's where the name of the team comes from. That's where Brooklyn Dodgers come from. The folks in LA, I don't know about, but in Brooklyn, they could do some dodging. So what happened is that they essentially had what came to be called the War of the Currents between Edison, who was backing DC current, and Tesla, who was backing, Edison was doing DC current, Tesla was doing alternating current. That had some great advantages. It's easier to transport. It's, you can use much lighter wire, so it's cheaper to transport, and you can do much, much higher voltages. Well, Edison, he tried to promote those high voltages, saying how dangerous they were. He would try to tell folks, oh, you can't do this AC power. It's way too dangerous. People would be getting electrocuted right and left. And what he would do is Tesla was being backed financially by a fellow named Westinghouse. And what Edison would do is he would go out to demonstrate the dangers of this stuff. He would hire local neighborhood kids to go and kidnap dogs and cats off the street. He would then bring in the reporters, and before the eyes of the reporter, he would electrocute these animals to show them how dangerous it was to use AC power. He didn't call it electrocuted, though. He called it Westinghoused, these poor animals. And this went on for years. But what finally really won the battle for Tesla is in 1893. They had a World's Fair, what was called the Columbia Exhibition in Chicago. And this was going to be the first World's Fair that had electricity, that had electrical lighting. Edison said, oh yeah, I can do that job. I can provide all the lighting, everything, for $1 million. Westinghouse underbid him by half. So Westinghouse and Tesla got the job. Now, again, this is before television. This is before, a lot of events. The World's Fair was the event to go to. Over the course of a couple of months that it took place, something like 1/4 of the United States population passed through those gates. So you had hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people being exposed to electricity for the first time. And for the first time, they saw this fella named Tesla doing demonstrations. So again, this is from another newspaper account of Mr. Tesla. Mr. Tesla has been seen receiving through his hands currents of a potential of more than 200,000 volts, vibrating 1 million times per second and manifesting themselves in dazzling streams of light. After such a striking test, which, by the way, no one has displayed a hurried inclination to repeat, Mr. Tesla's body and clothes have continued for some time to emit fine glimmers or halos of splintered light. In fact, an actual flame is produced by the agitation of electrostatically charged molecules, and the curious spectacle can be seen of pursuant white ethereal flames that do not consume anything, bursting from the ends of an induction coil, as though it were the bush on holy ground. That made a hell of an impression on the crowd, and that really won the War of the Currents. That was the last volley in it. He ended up winning. The prize, by the way, was he got to harness the power of Niagara Falls for hydroelectric power. So that's why we got all that electricity from there. So we have a whole range of these mad scientists going from, actually, if you count the alchemist, predating Frankenstein, all the way up to, he died in the early 1940s. So again, going fairly far up. Here we have a modern one, or a more modern one. Again, this is a guy who sort of embodies a lot of what we think of as the mad scientist. This is Werner von Braun. Okay, Werner von Braun, he was a good German, and he was working for the Germans during World War II. Okay, now his thing was rockets. He loved rockets. He wanted to use rockets. He wasn't real picky about who was giving them funding to work on the rockets. But, you know, his dream was to take people out into space on rockets. That was his big thing. But again, he's working for the Nazis during World War II, and he helped them develop something called the V-2 rocket. Okay, the V-2 rocket, in the latter stages of the war, they actually used it for the first time after the Normandy invasion, when the end was coming near. And they dropped thousands of these on London. So a lot of people died as a direct result of his work. And it's one of those things where, again, you could say, well, he's evil because he developed this horrible, horrible weapon. On the other hand, you could think he's just an opportunist. The arguments are still going on, but regardless of what your verdict is, he made this weapon that killed thousands of people. We apparently thought that was a useful skill, because after the war, we captured him. We captured him and a bunch of other German rocket scientists, and we brought them over to America in something called Project Paperclip. In fact, actually, one of the first places they came once they had them in the country was actually the Aberdeen Proving Ground, just a bit north of here. They came in there, and then they went out to, I think they shipped them out to Texas from there, and he started building intercontinental ballistic missiles for us. Okay. Now, intercontinental ballistic missiles, great, kind of neat thing if you're a military guy. But his dream was still to go into space. And so even before Sputnik, even before we had a space program, he would go out and he would talk to audiences in his heavy German accent, talking about going into space. And he was both a brilliant scientist and also a brilliant speaker. He really got people charged up about this idea to going into space. And to give you, though, some idea of how bizarre, how surreal the scene was in the 1950s when this was going on. This was a time when Robert Oppenheimer, who had his own credentials as a mad scientist, went from being the most beloved scientist in America after he helped develop the atomic bomb to, within just a handful of years, being absolutely vilified because of the Red Scare and being accused and denounced as being a communist. At the same time, you had a former Nazi scientist who went from developing the V-2 rocket to, in 1955, appearing on Wonderful World of Disney to tell all the little kids about this cool space stuff and how you could get there, complete with an animated description of the astronauts going off into space. If you want to see it, it's on YouTube. It is absolutely a trip, a mind blower. But again, you had this very complex fellow, and we talked about Hunter directly inspiring, fictional mad scientist. Werner inspired, again, a great one, Dr. Strangelove. Dr. Strangelove, yes. Thank you. Dr. Strangelove, he, again, if you've seen the movie, it's a brilliant movie, again, was directly modeled off of sort of equal mixes of Werner von Braun and another fellow named Edward Teller, who was another atomic scientist at the time. And again, it became a sort of public trope, people talking about von Braun, about his image, about the things he was doing. Now, I don't know how many of you are Tom Lehrer fans. I was hoping that you were. Tom Lehrer, if you're not familiar with him, he was a mathematician, math professor up at MIT, but in his spare time, he would write songs. Rather biting satirical songs, which he would then go and perform on various TV shows and whatnot. And he at one point wrote an entire song about Werner von Braun. This, again, short excerpt. Don't say that he's hypocritical. Say rather that he's apolitical. Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department, says Werner von Braun. Yeah, the song itself, again, is on YouTube. It's brilliant, and it culminates with this part. You too may be a big hero once you've learned to count backward to 0. In German or in English, I know how to count down. And I'm learning Chinese, says Werner von Braun. So again, great mad science going there. Incidentally, as a side note, I wanted to put those lyrics in my book, and the editor's like, no, we can't do the copyright. We're not going there. So that's not in the book. The rest of the stories and the rest of the things I've been showing you are. But what I'm going to do in a couple minutes is we'll take some more questions and stuff. But I wanted to sort of close out. I had said at the beginning that you would be hard-pressed to find an image of a mad scientist who was not a white male. But I did want to close out with an image of a scientist who, in a lot of ways, embodied a lot of the obsession, a lot of the passion of the mad scientist, Marie Curie. And she's the person who discovered radiation. She discovered 2 elements and has a third that's been named after her. So brilliant, brilliant person. She was actually the first scientist of either gender to win not 1, but 2 Nobel Prizes, 1 in chemistry, 1 in physics. And I believe she may still be the only one to do that in both fields. Brilliant person, but I wanted to kind of leave you guys with a little upnote about science and about the passion and the love that these people, regardless of what you think of them personally, have for their disciplines. This, again, was a quote from Marie. I'm among those who think that science has great beauty. A scientist in his laboratory is not only a technician, he is also a child placed before natural phenomenon, which impress him like a fairy tale. We should not allow it to be believed that all scientific progress can be reduced to mechanism. Neither do I believe that the spirit of adventure runs any risk of disappearing in our world. If I see anything vital around me, it is precisely that spirit of adventure, which seems indestructible. Thank you.
I just say, based on the last few people you talked about, I'm surprised you didn't add this to your list of stereotypic characteristics, namely a Central European accent.
That actually is interesting. And in fact, if you think about it, if you think about a lot of the portrayals of mad scientists as the villain, they very, very frequently have those Eastern European accents. And that has 2 reasons. One is because, leading up to about World War I or so, the Germans were preeminent in a lot of sciences. They had folks like Max Planck, and they had Einstein, and they had all these great scientists who were working for them. And they made some amazing discoveries in terms of chemistry. So part of it is that. But I think a larger part of it, as a writer, is people trying to match up this idea of science with this idea of the alien or the foreign. And so you have a lot of stuff that is actually going on now, where you have folks that distrust science or don't believe science. At the same time, you have a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment or anti-foreigner sentiment. And so that was one way that they sort of blended some of that together. So what we have nowadays is not anything new, unfortunately.
Yes, I've read reviews, and I haven't read the book yet, of a book, I think it's called The End of Darkness.
Mm-hmm.
It just came out about the conflict between Westinghouse and Edison, and there was something in the review I thought was amazing, and I was wondering if you would tell the story about how Edison wanted to show an electrocution using AC, and what happened. Could you speak about that?
Yeah, well, if we go back for a minute, earlier I talked about how Edison would go and he would have folks procure dogs and cats and do the demonstrations. Well, again, that made an impression, but he was, again, also a bit of a showman. So things sort of escalated to, at one point, he actually used alternating current to electrocute an elephant. West Virginia, they had this zoo elephant that had killed a couple of keepers. And so they were going to put the animal down, and Edison got wind of it and thought, gee, let's not waste an opportunity. And so he staged this event in front of all of the press where they took this animal, and if you've got a strong stomach, it is the actual video from the execution is on YouTube. But they took this poor animal, strapped like copper plates to her feet, strapped them to wires, and electrocuted her with several thousand volts. If that's not frightening enough, there was also a great deal of talk at this time, again, about electricity in general. And the death penalty, of course, was very big back then, and there was various talk about different methods. Well, somebody came up with the idea, well, let's use electricity. Let's electrocute these criminals. Well, that raises the question then, should you use AC or DC? Well, quite frankly, neither Edison or Tesla had any intention of using their electricity, getting that associated with executing people. I mean, that's just bad press, right? So what happened is neither one of them wanted to have any part of it. But what Edison did is he used a couple of intermediaries, and he managed to procure some of the alternating current equipment that Tesla's laboratory had been using and Westinghouse had been funding. He managed to procure that, and he had a friend of his who was working for him develop something called the electric chair. And so it used alternating current. I actually have a description of it in my book, The First Execution Done by Electric Chair, and you have to have a fairly strong stomach in order to read it. The poor fellow, when they first used it, he burst into flames. So again, that was another fairly underhanded trick that Edison used, again, in order to form an association in the mind of the public between alternating current and people dying.
As you know, the Star Trek 50th anniversary was this week, and generally a pretty pro-science show.
Absolutely.
But there are a few mad scientists here and there. And of course, the distinction between being a bad guy and mad might be a question here. But are you familiar enough with the series to know some of the instances of...
Well, they did stuff in the Next Generation with the Data and Lore, and then the fellow who created both of them. All three played by Brent Spiner.
Eccentric, but he didn't seem to have some sort of malice or moral depravity or something.
Well, it's actually interesting. When you read stuff, literary criticisms of this mad scientist trope, they kind of get classified into two different categories. From a literary point of view, you have those mad scientists that are clearly, evil or want to use their creations for evil things, but then there's also quite a bit of literature on those that had good intentions and things just went wrong. And in fact, Victor Frankenstein had good intentions. It just didn't quite work out as he had planned. So that's actually one I think that goes fairly nicely with a number of Star Trek stories.
I'm still interested in Tesla experimenting on himself with 20,000 volts.
Yeah.
He didn't die from it.
No, what
How
happens...
does he know how much to do?
Well, what happens is that they mention in the article that I cited how fast the vibrations were, the frequency. And that's apparently the trick is when you get up to a high enough frequency, what happens is instead of the electricity going through you, it passes across the surface. Okay. Now, it's interesting, Tesla, smart guy, when he would do these demonstrations, he would take precautions like wearing shoes with 6-inch thick cork soles so that he was not... Now, just think about that for a second. This was back in the late 1800s when my size, 5'6", was average height for men. Tesla was 6'6". 6'6", add another 6-inch for the cork soles, and he is towering, literally towering in front of the crowd doing these miraculous things. I mean, it's no wonder that people were just blown away.
Did you go further back in time in cosmology, like Copernicus or Galileo? Were they considered mad scientists?
In their ways, yeah. Actually, the first one that I start with in the book is actually Archimedes. So I start with Archimedes. I actually start with him, and in the first chapter I have him, and also another woman who met her end at the hands of a violent torch-wielding mob named Hypatia of Alexandria. Very, very brilliant person, very interesting individual who met a very tragic end. So again, I didn't unfortunately get much into Galileo. What I tried to do in the book is I kind of grouped the chapters by discipline. So I have one on the alchemist, I'd have one on chemistry, one on electricity, and so forth. So as I said, there were lots of folks that I would have loved to have put in. I would have loved to have put, say, Richard Feynman in, one of my favorite scientists of all times, who certainly was out there. There's a fellow named Jack Parsons. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with Jack Parsons. Yeah, Jack Parsons, there's a great book about him called Sex and Rockets. He was a fairly wild guy, and he's one of the founders of the Jet Propulsion Lab. Brilliant guy who was probably one of the world's leading experts on explosives and ritual magic. Yeah, I could spend a great deal of time talking about him too. So there were plenty of great scientists that unfortunately didn't make it in. So talk to my publisher. We'll do another edition. It'll be awesome. Other questions? Yes.
I just remembered, there's something in the Jewish tradition of this. There's the legend of the golem.
Yes.
Yes.
Familiar with that?
Yes.
Yeah, very much. So that, again, was very, very much part of the Frankenstein story, and this idea that you had this creation that gets out of hand and ultimately needs to be destroyed. So yeah, that there is a very close association between that and the Frankenstein story. So very close associations with it. It's interesting. Another fellow who I didn't unfortunately put in the book was Albert Einstein. And Albert Einstein, when he won his Nobel Prize, there were a lot of scientists, German scientists, who were campaigning against him, and actually a lot of American scientists who were claiming that his science was just a little too Jewish to make the cut. So there was a great tradition of anti-Semitism, which again sort of ties in. Not only do a lot of these scientists have foreign accents, but a lot of them were Jewish. So interesting convergence of tropes.
I get the impression that the mad science, the fictional scientists that you talk about were failures.
Mm-hmm.
They're what they did went wrong. Whereas all the real ones you talk about, however crazy they may have been, they contributed something to science. They actually had an accomplishment. Is that a theme in your book?
Well, it's interesting. On the one hand, yeah, that they all had great successes. On the other hand, a number of them did end tragically. Nikola Tesla, brilliant guy, did amazing discoveries, has more, I think there's only like one or two other people that have more patents than he does on record, but he died penniless in a New York hotel. One of the fellows that I talk about in the book is Ignaz Semmelweis, who actually did the revolutionary thing of getting doctors to wash their hands before doing internal examinations. And he actually died in an insane asylum. So, really he didn't get his credit, his due, until long after he was dead, unfortunately. So that was also one of the things that happens with some of the folks in the book.
I imagine there are many dysfunctional mad scientists that have never been famous and obscure, and so there have been some successes and many failures.
Yeah. It's also interesting to note that a lot of these scientists were making their reputations, making their discoveries back when scientists were very often working on their own. There was a time when scientists, well, before the word scientist had been invented, the domain of science was really performed by people that were usually rich and had way too much free time on their hands and could afford to waste time on things like this. In the Industrial Revolution, they had people that started doing science for a living. And so in 1833, they actually coined the term scientist. That's when it came into use, because there was a dispute at a scientific meeting between the poet Coleridge and one of the other scientists there. And so at the meeting, they decided, well, we need a word for these folks that do science for a living. What they ended up doing was they knew that people who do art for a living are called artists, so let's just stick science in there instead of art. So kind of interesting. Without artists, you wouldn't have scientists. An interesting thought to close on. Again, I thank you all for coming out. If you'd like to check out my blog, it's at mad4science.wordpress.com. Thank you.